Anjan, transcendent is a descriptor that we apply to art. But what makes it so? What makes art transcendent? I know you as a cognitive neuroscientist are working on a project that deals with this issue. Tell me about it.
The word transcendent means you're transcending something, right? And what is it we're transcending? So one take that we are using is about language. What is the relationship between language and our experience of art? What we are trying to do is establish a taxonomy, a vocabulary for how we experience art, the impact that art can have. And in order to do that, we're trying to lay out the semantic space of these kinds of impacts. The way we went about this was to engage a number of experts from different domains. So we had a theologian, an art historian, a philosopher of art, a psychologist, and I represented neuroscience, and brainstormed over two extended sessions of what are the words, what kind of impacts one might have. And once we had this catalog of words, we actually crowdsourced it, where we put the words out and other just average people had to generate as many words that they thought were associated with, for example, joy might be an experience that one might have, right? What are all the words in a minute that you can think of that are associated with this in the context of art? When you do that, very smart people, some of them who work with me, can create these mathematically derived semantic networks that lays out this space and also shows where the clusters of responses are, right? So that then allows us to say, here are the potential impacts of art, right? And hopefully will allow us now to do experiments where we're asking the question of what kind of impacts do art have? But if I can go back to your original question, there's a deep issue that we are struggling with, which is a kind of cousin to the term transcendent might be ineffable, right? People often say the power of art comes in its ineffability. It might seem paradoxical that we're trying to lay out what is effable, what is language around art. But I do have the intuition and the belief that more language enriches your experience when it's complex, and it gets you to the point of maybe what's beyond that is what's the ineffable that you're trying to reach. Oh. So it's a little bit like, not to be pretentious about this, but Wittgenstein in his Tractatus talking about, language gets you up a ladder, but then you discard it because that of which you cannot speak, you pass over in silence.
Yeah, I know when I listen to music, which is the art form that I've mostly identified with, that I don't like to read the notes about the symphony, the Mahler symphony, or Bruckner, or Brahms, or whatever. That inhibits me, at least initially. Sometimes curiosity, I'll do that, because I want to just have the abstract experience and have myself engage with it. When I find out the composer wrote it for this and that reason, it deflates it for me.
This is a common question that comes up, and sometimes as a criticism, not as a question. I think that at least if you have the repeated experience, that the way in which that information, the semantic information maybe interferes, tends to have less and less of an impact. The other analogy I use sometimes is wine tasting or bourbon tasting. It's a complex sensory experience. We have very hard time putting those into words, right? But if someone describes a sip of bourbon as having kind of a leathery feel with a vanilla finish, right? now that I have those words, I can notice that I'm experiencing those, and it sort of enriches my experience of other spirits.
On the
as
other
well.
hand, it prevents you from having other feelings about it. Can you now drink the bourbon thinking anything other than leathery vanilla?
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
But I think those become automatic,
Okay.
that after a while it just becomes part of the experience of differentiating a complex experience.
When you've built this semantic map
Yeah.
of the language of art, I like to, when I deal with taxonomies, which I think is a wonderful way to begin any study, you lay out the total landscape of what's happening, see how it reorganizes itself. I think that's absolutely the best first step. How many different major categories do you have? I mean, order of magnitude, is it 5 or is it 50?
We started out with over 60 terms,
Okay.
and then they reduced broadly to about 11 categories. And then you can further reduce that to 4 categories. And we're still working that out.
What are the 4 categories?
It's a granularity question,
Sure,
which is the
sure.
more coarser the granula, you're also losing some information, right?
Right.
So when it comes down to the 4, it's things like positive affect, negative affect, being disturbed. It's things that are so broad.
Are they scales like positive and negative affect, or are they just categories? Do they all have amplitudes?
So not in the way that we have done them. We think they have amplitudes, but it's the way these words cluster together that you can see all of these. There's anxiety, fear, anger, right? You look at those words that are all clustering together, we know that's negative affect, for example. So that's me imposing a term on top of what those clusters are.
I think that whole process is worthwhile. I mean, you can really study at all those different levels. And there's certainly more rich information at the granular level, at the 60 level, and as you build up, you'll lose things, and sometimes you may make an average, which you'll lose everything. I mean, if you have a bimodal peak and you just take an average, you have a real average, but you've sampled, there won't be anything in your sample that is at that level.
Absolutely. And the other thing is art is not a natural kind, right? Different art does different things. So this now allows us now to develop a notion of what art is doing, what has what kind of impact.